As the previous installation had laid out the general conditions of the combat operation unfolding in the northeast of Dallas to be immediately followed up by the combat operation that was to occur against the 2nd of the 142nd, which was an American Mechanized Infantry Battalion tasked with the immediate security of the new Raytheon site, which had been moved from its previous location in the city of Garland to the city of Richardson, north of the downtown of Dallas. As this Mechanized Infantry Battalion, the 2nd of the 142nd, was in fact a part of the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, which was tasked with some additional attached units, such as the 1st of the 204th, which was a SHORAD battalion from the Mississippi National Guard 66th Troop Command, as well as also the 2nd of the 198th, an armored battalion from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, attached also to the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. This Mechanized Infantry Battalion, as a direct part of the 56th, had been deployed to this area specifically in the defense of this Raytheon site, as this was a very important site, as the American military-industrial complex was relatively small, and each and every single solitary site was of great importance to the national defense, as America's military-industrial complex, being as small as it was, highly depended on some of these larger sites for their defense needs. As it pertained to the targeting of the military-industrial sites, the PLAAF utilized a variety of weapon systems, including their H-20 heavy strategic stealth bomber, which carried a whopping 90,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, as well as also their H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, as one had completely annihilated the Lockheed Martin facility, which was located literally down the street from the Naval Air Station in White Settlement. These heavy strategic bombers carried a punishing 34,000 pounds, although the H-20 carried nearly 3 times the weight of the already vaunted H-6K. Not only were these heavy strategic bombers utilized in the role of hitting specific targets according to the original war planning, so were the strike aircraft such as the JH-7s, although they were utilized in the strike capacity on different sites and even certain units on the ground in a tactical bombing capacity, they could also be called upon for close air support as well, and frequently were, as each one of these aircraft could carry 20,000 square pounds, roughly, of air-to-ground munitions. Although slightly short than that, it will be rounded up for simplicity's sake, as these aircraft were also aided by the arrival of very potent fighter aircraft conducting combat air patrols in the area to ensure air superiority. The aircraft were all kept in the air for a relatively lengthy amount of time by the myriad of refueling aircraft that were operating at this time in the North Texas and southern Oklahoma area, a mixture of Chinese refueling aircraft such as the YY-20 or YU-20s, as well as the Russian IL-78 refueling aircraft as well, as all of these refuelers could keep the fighter and ground attack squadrons, and even in certain instances, the heavy strategic bombing aircraft on station for many hours, as the YY-20 or YU-20 in particular was the third largest refueling aircraft in the world and carried 180,000 pounds of jet fuel, or effectively 90 tons, as the IL-78s carried less. They were still an important refueling aircraft nonetheless, and were a chief part of the air logistical elements that were now operating over U.S. airspace. As the forces operating in the northeast of Dallas were in effect taking a massive detour This was another testament to the high flexibility of the PLA forces as a direct result of their gargantuan surveillance apparatus, as well as also the real-time AI battlefield data processing system being linked into it and guiding these units on their direct ground movements and other operations, even putting together the pre-prepared strike packages for artillery, missile forces, and even the air power. As the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, whose chief objective was the destruction of the 2nd of the 142nd, was able to take a slight detour in this instance, that was again a testament to the high flexibility, and they would assist the Combat Engineer Battalion also operating in this area, as they had in effect been called in to also deal with this threat, as I-635 would become a chief logistical route for the forces fighting on this side of the Metroplex. All threats to logistical vehicles, including these armed reactionary civilians, had to be dealt with and dealt with immediately, as there were over 600 of them. This was a necessity, and as covered in the previous installation, the combat unfolding around the highway, at least in this 1 mile north-south by 1 kilometer east-west area, was being carried out by two companies of mechanized infantry coming from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 16th ID, tasked with this particular combat detour to assist the combat engineers who were operating immediately east of this area, as well as they too were in effect moving up the streets in their different companies, ultimately to pivot and surround the area and flush out any possible remaining resistance, although within an hour's time there would be few, if any, left standing in terms of the armed reactionary civilian elements, as these companies were moving in a very thorough manner through the streets and clearing the adjacent buildings on either side of each street in this particular area. As two combat platoons of mechanized infantry would move through this area on the west side of I-635, they would only deploy 2 of their 3 combat platoons of mechanized infantry due to the simple fact that there was far less resistance on the side of the highway at this particular time, as many armed reactionary civilians had moved to this side of the highway. Others yet still would try to move back to the west side of the highway to escape all of the movements now unfolding by the mechanized infantry, and even further to the east by combat engineers moving up this particular area as well, as the 4 additional mechanized infantry companies within the battalion were already moving on to Richardson to initiate the surrounding procedures. They were being followed by the Headquarters and Support Company, which was the command and logistical elements over the entire battalion, as the Fire Support Company would in effect be the last to fall in behind these forces. These 2 companies, upon having cleared this entire area, would all remount in their vehicles and proceed behind the other 5 companies, the 4 Mechanized Infantry and Headquarters and Support Company, after, again, they had spent roughly an hour in this particular area, having taken 40 minutes to get here. It would take them a short time after this combat operation to arrive in Richardson behind the other companies that were already taking their place in the surrounding operations of a large area consisting of a massive industrial site in Richardson to the immediate west of State Highway 75 that was effectively surrounded by residential and semi-commercial areas. As this was a mixed residential and commercial area in and of itself, these different squads, as mentioned before, were flushing out housing neighborhoods and apartment blocks, as well as a mixture of different commercial sites, including gas stations, restaurants, fast food restaurants, auto repair shops, office buildings, and also apartment complexes that were located sporadically throughout this area, as initiating this map, of course, 2 precision-guided 1,000-pound munitions had been dropped by 1 J-10 fighter that was immediately on scene to assist with the operations unfolding on the ground, as well as being struck by 4 CM-502KG dual-purpose anti-ship anti-tank missiles fired by a lone Wing-Loom 2 dedicated combat drone, while this J-10 fighter had fired a long-range air-to-ground standoff cruise missile, a KD-88, at targets further afield, as there were still small groupings of enemy forces in other parts of the city that had to be dealt with, not on the scale of what was occurring here, but small groupings had been sighted by the high-altitude drones and thus were prepared to be struck through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, putting together the pre-prepared strike packages. As the company of mechanized infantry that was operating to the east of I-635 was methodically moving through these areas, as the dismounted squads of each platoon and the vehicles were providing one another mutual support tactically as the squads moved on either side of the streets, while the vehicles moved up the center to provide them direct support firing up the streets, while the follow-up armor personnel carriers with staggered weapons could also provide support to the dismounted infantry squads, and the infantry squad dismounts could provide support to their vehicles if and when needed. As this housing neighborhood had been flushed out, the quadcopters of each squad were running circuits ahead of their forces to map out the area in real time and thus direct not only their firepower, but the firepower of other friendly forces in the field, such as their vehicles that were moving up the streets alongside of the squads, which, as they flushed out these houses and one squad remained outside to fire ahead through this fence, they then bounded tactically into these houses to clear them, after first eliminating enemy forces that had emerged from the buildings. As that had occurred, this squad would come out first and hold the area in a wedge formation, allowing for this squad to bound into the rental office first, followed by this squad, as the vehicles would then move up alongside of them, while this squad here, moving ahead after eliminating these forces, would then move alongside their vehicle, take cover by their lead IFE, which is their ZBD-04A, and then bound and take this corner, firing at enemy forces ahead, as there was a large number of forces steadily moving through this area to enter the hospital to take cover, as it was a relatively large and stout building, as the building material was concrete and other materials. This was a tough building, to be sure, as it was multiple floored, and it was perceived as a relatively safe area by some of these armed reactionary civilian elements, although they would be hit heavily by ISR-directed mortar strikes from the very powerful 120mm mortars, which were coming from the PLL-05 dual-purpose 120mm heavy mortar / assault guns, which could be brought forward and utilized as an assault gun, a direct fire weapon into enemy strong points, or canted and fired as a heavy mortar. Also being utilized by the fire support company were their two firing platoons of the Type 63 short-range light artillery MLRS 130mm systems, which were exceedingly rapid and easy to reload, and these rockets being laid down in large amounts could cause a wide array of destruction, as the combo of the dual-purpose assault gun / mortars and the light artillery rockets would wreak havoc on enemy forces, as these were superb fire support weapons for each and every mechanized infantry battalion. As these forces were steadily moving up the streets with their vehicles in tow as the squads moved alongside of them, they were able to keep pace with one another and provide mutual support while also clearing out the city blocks. As they came upon each block and they entered the buildings, they could fire out from the buildings as well as from the corners and annihilate enemy forces, and they would bound and cover tactically with one another, leaving some outside to provide mutual support between their vehicles and themselves, as well as also providing support as per proper building clearance procedures for their troops in the buildings, although the vehicles were still outside as well to provide this type of support, as enemy forces could flee and they could be cut down by the vehicle-based firepower, as well as also the infantry-based firepower, as this squad from this platoon would move up and take a corner while this rolling T would clear this building, with this squad coming from this platoon, as they had two of their squads to their west and they had three of their squads to their east covering this housing neighborhood. They would clear this apartment block, and as these enemy personnel would leave, they would take heavy fire and lose some of their number until they got to this point and decided to try to enter the building, by which time this original Rolling T squad would have moved up with their vehicles and cut the rest of them down. As also, again, the CH-901As played a massive role in this operation, targeting those on high ground, such as rooftops, as these were seen as high-priority targets, as they had a wider surveillance of the battlefield and could fire at these ground-based forces far easier from higher ground than they could at lower ground, and thus these vehicles and troops cooperated at firing at these personnel on the roofs as well, although the loitering munitions played a massive role in the elimination of these forces, although the 30mm autocannon would shred through the building material with their armor-piercing HE ammunition and shred these forces to pieces, or even firing a 100mm main gun round into this building would also blast these personnel to pieces. They would also be hit by well-timed CH-901As with their AI target-seeking mode honing in on these forces and hitting them as well at roughly the same time as the ground-based fire was coming in, as it was not uncommon throughout the entire invasion and many of the campaigns for multiple weapon systems to hit the same target at roughly the same time, as these personnel had been cut down by the infantry-based personnel at this corner, as well as the vehicle-based fire. They had been eliminated the same way as these personnel had been on this side. As these two squads had taken the rental office, one would then bound to clear this building, while this squad, having moved up and temporarily taken cover by their vehicles, would bound to this corner. And as they were clearing this building, they would remain outside to provide support from firing around the corner. These personnel, while this squad, having gone in the rental office along with this squad, as they had taken position to watch the streets while they bounded into the rental office, they following behind would then take this corner, fire at these personnel in a short exchange of fire, leading to them trying to retreat, leading to them taking the corner and cutting them down by the time they reached this point. With this squad having cleared this building of its 8 enemy personnel inside, they would then advance to clear this building, while this squad would then advance into this building, at which time, as these personnel were continually running away from the combat engineers, which were immediately off the map and to the east, they would continue to be fired at from these buildings by this squad and this squad having entered and cleared these buildings and now using them as a position to fire outside the windows at these personnel, which repeated mortar strikes were still being called in by the ISR surveillance apparatus, claiming more and more victims as they ran through this street, and they would exchange fire back and forth from the buildings and these personnel into the buildings as they ran frantically for cover, at which point this squad, having taken this corner and firing at these personnel reaching this point, would then bound here and continue firing, allowing for this squad to tactically advance into the hospital while they covered the street and the higher windows of the hospital structure, allowing then for this squad to also bound and take another entrance into the hospital building, as then this squad would then advance to this position and hold their position outside before being called into the building, as again, that was another flexible aspect of these tactics of building clearance procedures, as the outside squad could not only cover any retreats, but could also be called in if needed to assist, as this was a large building and had to be cleared. It needs to be understood at all times that all of these different events were taking place at roughly the same time, as all of these vehicles and their movements up the streets, as well as the troops clearing these blocks, was all highly synchronized and being done at roughly the same time. This all operated on a very strict timetable as these forces moved in to clear these buildings in their different tactical formations, tailored according to their requirements, as some buildings were higher than others. Rolling T formations were outstanding formations for clearing these structures, as having 3-point men, 2 to watch the higher levels on each side, while one clearing the center first level, while staggered weapons following behind them with the rest of the squad could clear either side. This was an outstanding building clearance formation, although the wedge formation was also still highly relevant in this case as well, as also they utilized line formations, which also involved having staggered weapons, of course, to cover all 360 degrees of approach against these forces. And as all of these squads were working together through the use of their combat data links, as each Squad NCO carried one, as well as also their helmet-based radio sets built into their helmets for inter-squad and inter-platoon and ultimately inter-company communications. This allowed for these forces to operate in such a highly synchronized manner, as the vehicles also had their own vehicle-based combat data links built into the APCs and IFVs, which aided also in working together with their dismounted squads, as each squad came from their own respective vehicle, whether it was an armor personnel carrier such as the Type 89A or the infantry fighting vehicle in each platoon, such as the ZBD-04A, as it bristled with many weapons, such as its very powerful 100mm main gun, its connected 30mm autocannon, which was also enormously powerful with its different ammunition types, as well as also 2 pods for HJ-09 ATGM anti-tank guided missiles, as well as also even a 7.62 by 50mm coaxial machine gun, which was highly effective against dismounted infantry troops, as the heavy turret-based W-85 12.7mm machine guns were also a very powerful weapon. These effectively, as armor personnel carriers, acted as mobile fire support platforms, effectively mobile machine gun nests with heavy machine gun fire to support their dismounted troops, operating in their various tactical formations, as even they could utilize a line formation in a specific direction, such as these troops in the kneeling and prone positions firing at these personnel on the other side of this boulevard as they moved. As the different room clearance operations were going on at this time as well in each and every building, each squad would typically break down into 2 half squads or 5-man stack teams, if you will, and would operate on either side of a hallway, moving tactically down the hall with the point men having their weapons facing diagonal to cover corners, as this would make it easier to hit personnel trying to take cover behind corners, while the stack teams would stop by each and every entry point, such as doorways, and have a breach man come and kick the door open, such as this flimsy door being kicked open by a swift kick from the breach man, who was not flagging his troops. As you can see, the barrel is pointing down the hall diagonally, as he is preparing to move back into his position as the breach man at the very end of this stack team. And as they had open source intelligence on each and every building, as the building layouts were all processed by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as well as street grid layouts, terrain maps, and more, the troops were already aware of the room sizes, and if there was a small room, the entire stack team would not be sent in, and rather only a few personnel would be sent in, such as what had occurred in this room, as the 2 ran in firing at this typical office couch, wherein this man had been firing from 2 shots through the door that smacked harmlessly into the hall after the door was then kicked open swiftly after the shots were fired, and the man tried to slide under the couch as these 2 ran in shooting, but was instead peppered alongside of the couch and the wall and the windows being shot out by these 2 troops coming in with their weapons blazing. As they had formally cleared the room, they then would yell clear, and they would rejoin their stack team and continue on down the hall until they got to their next room to clear that as well. In larger rooms, sometimes they would be given guidance on using hand grenades to clear larger rooms, but typically in these smaller rooms, they would not typically use a hand grenade unless the layout of the room and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had given them guidance to do so. As all of these forces moved up the streets and they moved tactically through buildings, they would rapidly and precisely clear this particular part of the city of Dallas, as in northeast Dallas along I-635, as highways were still, again, highly important in terms of the priorities of the PLA forces on the ground, as again, these would also serve as chief logistical routes if they weren't the main invasion routes, such as I-35, which was the most important route to secure of all. That, in fact, was at the highest of all the objectives of the Trojan shock forces, at least in this particular area, with the other highest objectives being the total and complete eradication of American military and paramilitary forces wherever found, with armed reactionary civilians being among the lowest priorities, unless, of course, again, they were along key highways which needed to be cleared of any and all resistance, as the military industrial sites and other such sites like political sites were also seen as major key objectives. They too were also dealt with in different ways, some being outright annihilated and destroyed, and some being captured. As in this particular instance, as again this was a very short-lived battle, as two companies would rapidly flush out an area of this size, these forces continued moving with a high degree of precision through this area, and as they cleared this shopping center, as this squad, this original rolling T formation, would then enter this building and breach some of the shops in this way, with another squad having cleared this building, moving in to clear it from this direction, leaving another squad in this apartment block temporarily, and this squad remaining in this position. The vehicles would continue moving up outside as these squads, with this vehicle moving up here, had cleared these sites and moved into the hospital respectively, and moved up alongside this now cratered, rubbled, ruined block, as these two squads, having cleared this particular shopping center, would then move out, and after temporarily taking some fire from forces that had been moving through this area, along with their vehicle-based fire, returning fire before these troops had crossed, they then would advance alongside their vehicles. Remember, as these forces were going in here, these actions were happening simultaneously. Again, many things are happening at about the same time, including these forces moving up along this side of this destroyed city block as well. And these forces already had been destroyed by immense rocket fire, as again, the Type 63 multiple launch rocket systems were rapid to reload and also easy to fire en masse. And they caused immense damage in this particular area, leaving the vehicles to move up and effectively encounter no resistance on the city block, having had already been destroyed by the combination of airdrop munitions, heavy mortar fire repeated, and rocket strikes as well, and moving up to find no resistance. At the same time, these actions had been occurring over in this area where there was temporary fire exchange from the building tops and from outside against these squads moving up through this gas station area, as the squad had been outside and they took their position here, while this squad, having cleared the gas station, had moved out and prepared to bound over to this area here by their vehicles as they moved up, while these two squads, this wedge and this line formation following behind, prepared to bound into this building as they took their position, as this squad took their position right here. As two squads entered, this squad would then enter and breach as well, while this squad, also having cleared the shopping center, would then, after taking cover by their vehicles, bound further up with their vehicles and then eventually be called into the restaurant as well, as they were to be gone into the roof to take up position to overwatch their squads as they moved and cleared other buildings in the area. As this was the tallest building in this particular line of buildings, it gave them oversight to assist not only their vehicles moving up, mutual support, but also mutually support their forces moving in to clear these other buildings, namely fast food restaurants and an auto repair shop. As these personnel outside this restaurant had been wiped out early on by these forces of these two squads, having cut them down, they then again had moved into this building, while this squad had moved up alongside of their vehicles and then entered the building as well. And then they would move on and clear these buildings, with two squads moving into this building, while this squad would take position outside as per building clearance procedures, with vehicles on the other side moving up, and two squads would again proceed into this building and clear it, as there was a brief exchange of fire with these personnel outside of this building here, with this squad and the vehicles moving up together, assisting them, mutual support. This squad would then bound alongside of their vehicles, as the vehicles were also firing forward and cutting many of these personnel down, although some made it alive onto the highway, where they exchanged fire with these two half squads from this double column formation that had moved up and split into two half squads and moved rapidly before taking contact, which made them then bound and cover tactically against their forces, as one squad would bound ahead, lay down fire, then the next squad would bound a little bit ahead, lay down fire, and so on and so forth. As they got to where they were closing on their enemies within grenade range, the other squads operating in this area along the incline that the highway sat on top were moving through this grassy, hilly area using the tall grass as concealment, although it wasn't cover. The armed reactionary civilians coming from this underpass had effectively tried to do the same thing, as there was a brief exchange of fire between these squads. As the squad had moved here and taken contact, they dropped into the prone and exchanged fire as these personnel then tried to turn and face them using an area on this incline with tall grass as concealment as well, but they were seen by the quadcopter assets and fire was directed immediately into their position, as well as vehicle-based fire early on before these vehicles had moved up as these buildings were being cleared. Again, many things happening at the same time as these forces were running through the area. These two half squads had cut many of them down, although some made it to the other side. They were engaged by the vehicle-based fire from this platoon of this other company of mechanized infantry that had early on destroyed these personnel in the underpass with their well-directed vehicle-based fire coming from their lead ZBDO-4A. As again mentioned in the previous installation, these two squads from this platoon of the other company on the western side of the highway had dispatched two of their squads out of their armored personnel carriers, their Type 89As, to clear this building, as well as directing vehicle-based fire on these personnel from further back that exchanged fire briefly with them and were destroyed as a result of well-directed ISR-directed fire from the vehicles as the quadcopters were running circuits in this area. As again, each vehicle crew and dismounted squad had their own quadcopter asset, and they all worked together to map out the area in real time, which placed enemy units in real time on the combat data links as well as friendly units, and as they were destroyed, they were removed in real time as well as the ISR assets could see them. And the real-time AI battlefield data processing system advised all these forces on their movements as they moved into the area and dispatched their squads to clear buildings and hold the roads. This squad would offer mutual support with their vehicles, who would then move up ahead of them, still being in this wedge formation, able to offer mutual support. The vehicles would fire their anti-tank guided missiles, their HJO-9s, into this building, as well as 100mm fire, 30mm autocannon fire, and annihilate some of the personnel that were on this side of the building and completely destroy the building facade as well. As the final two squads of this platoon were dispatched, they would then bound and cover tactically toward the building and lay down fire, giving this platoon covering fire for them to move into position after they had eradicated these armed reactionary civilians and fired ahead and destroyed them. As they got into this position here, their vehicles would take fire but return fire to this side of the building as they would dispatch their squads, 3 of which would go and clear the building, while 1 would cover the outside with the vehicles covering this side, and 1 would cover this side, while again, 1 squad, after taking position beside their lead ZBDO-4A, would then bound toward the building after these 2 squads had first breached, with the lead ZBDO-4A then pivoting its weapons toward the building to cover the entry of their squads tactically. As some of these personnel early on had fled this building as it was being cleared, some of them had made it to this point here before they decided to try to go around the building, but were then cut down by fire from this platoon's vehicles. As all of this, again, was all happening at roughly the same time, all of the movements on the west side of the highway and all of the movements on the east side of the highway, this was a very quick but very savage instance of combat. As again, this was effectively a detour for this mechanized infantry battalion's assets in the form of 2 of its companies of mechanized infantry. They would then, upon clearing this area, remount in their vehicles, reform up as their company elements, including their headquarters platoons, which were the command and logistical elements of each mechanized infantry company, and fall in and follow the rest of their battalion towards Richardson, while the combat engineers operating to the east would then pivot and flush this area out to ensure that it was completely and totally clear of enemy personnel. As the fighting occurring in the city of Richardson was especially destructive, as it would involve the PLAAF, the Strategic Missile Forces, which also by proxy included the container-based cruise missile systems, as at 2 a.m., by the time the entire battalion had arrived in the area of mechanized infantry to surround the 2nd of the 142nd before they were completely and totally annihilated by the two H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft tasked with the destruction of the Raytheon facility, as well as they were bivouacked there, the 2nd of the 142nd on the ground. The pummeling of this facility by thousands of pounds, 68,000 pounds to be precise, of air-to-ground munitions from both H-6Ks would eradicate the vast majority of the forces of the 2nd of the 142nd, which would try to scatter and scurry as fast as they could, but they would not be able to get away from the carpet munitioning going on against the facility, although there would be a small number that were on the outer edges in other industrial sites that were part of the larger industrial park that were requisitioned for their use, as these were perimeter areas that were fortified by some of these troops in sandbag machine gun emplacements, foxholes that were dug, some with sandbags, some without. These areas would be those that would be heavily assaulted by the ground troops of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion moving in to surround this area, such as in this particular image where a portion of a squad is pictured with this soldier now just laying down his RPG after firing it a second earlier, which was being fired at this building, his Type 69, as the light machine gunner with his QBJ-201s laying down heavy fire, riflemen laying down fire as well, others from another squad that were further off this image, as the ZBD-04A pictured is firing one of two HJ-09 ATGMs, its 100mm main gun, and it also has available its 30mm autocannon immediately connected to it, as well as its 7.62x54 coaxial weapon with the heavy W85 12.7mm machine gun, which was also being used to great effect, as this would be a mobile heavy fire support platform in and of itself to assist the troops in their advance towards these outer buildings, while slightly further away, the carpet munitioning raid had occurred, wherein the vast majority of this large industrial center had been completely eradicated, a large swathe of Richardson completely gone in a cloud of debris and smoke, as the thousands of pounds of air-to-ground munitions completely flattened an area that was just over a half mile by 2 miles in length. As also tactical ballistic and cruise missiles came in and struck the area as well. As in this particular map, the mechanized infantry companies, all 6 of them, had moved in to surround this 3-mile by 1.5-mile area, as this was a large industrial area within Richardson that was immediately to the west of State Highway 75, wherein even their fire support company had moved in to assist in the surrounding effort, with the only company not pictured being the headquarters and support company, which was immediately off the map, as even after the combat action that had occurred in northeast Dallas had concluded, these forces still had enough ammunition to at least be able to surround and mop up the forces that were on the outer perimeter areas of the industrial site, although the rest had been completely carpet munitioned and had completely gone up in smoke along with the buildings. As the fire support company had moved in by the highway and were safe in their positions, the first munitions were dropped at this point here and completely destroyed everything, but even though it was danger close, the calculations of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had deemed it safe, and when the first munitions were dropped, this platoon was a bit further back in this apartment complex, as the facades of these buildings were damaged, but the main destruction had occurred here. These 2 heavy strategic bombers are flying almost wingtip to wingtip. However, if they'd have spread out, the damage would have been even more widespread than a just over half-mile area in width. The length of it, as this is a 3-mile total length map, the length of it was nearly 2 miles of destruction, as they had stopped dropping their munitions at about this point. And all of the troops that were bivouacked in this area and onward would nearly be completely annihilated, nearly an entire battalion gone, as they were escorted in as per SOP by a pair of fighter aircraft, these J-11 fighters. They also were escorting the heavy strategic bombers in as per again, standard operating procedure, as it was very early on in the campaign, and there were no guarantees that there wouldn't be any enemy air threats, although at least as for the naval aviation in the area, that had been totally eradicated, although the USAF and other naval aviation elements were, as early as 2 a.m., not completely out of the battle yet. For the most part, the vast majority of the USAF and the naval aviation had been taken out of the picture in terms of the overall nationwide invasion. As, again, this was done more out of SOP than anything else. The heavy strategic bombers, the 5 DF-15Bs, and the 5 container-based YJ-18C supersonic cruise missiles. They were not hypersonic, but they were also not subsonic. They broke the sound barrier, so they were just supersonic, would hit this area, as this circle indicates the area of destruction. As this was an undeveloped lot in this area, one company would move into this lot and take a position in the direct south of the industrial center on the opposite side of this boulevard. As in this particular image here, this squad had dismounted from their armor personnel carrier, their Type 89A, which would act as a heavy fire support platform with its W-85 12.7mm machine gun. The squad NCO would put down his combat data link, which also controlled their squad's quadcopter asset, and picked up an HJ-08 anti-tank guided missile, having been moved out of their armored personnel carrier where all their ammunition and heavy weapons were stored, such as this HJ-08, also Type 69 rocket propelled grenades, and prepared to fire at a target. As again, the few remaining elements of the entire 2nd of the 142nd, as all of its comprising companies were going up in complete smoke with the heavy strategic bombing operation, as well as tactical ballistic missile strikes in this area, in conjunction with the bombing, which would, the last bombs be dropped here, which would destroy these industrial warehouses and factory sites in this area, as there were rail links into this area, such as here, the combat being heavy in this area with the ground-to-ground component of it, with the American infantry troops taking up position in some of the outer offices and warehouse buildings, and along their sandbag machine gun emplacements and individual foxholes, such as in this particular area, in this grassy area, having had dug in foxholes by this office, as this was one of those office buildings with a grassy area out in front with these other office buildings here as well, which would be destroyed by air-to-ground munitions and hits from what would now be CH-901As equipped with heat warheads, having been freshly fired by the headquarters and support company, which was just behind the fire support company and off map in this mixed commercial and residential area, just off the map to the east of the highway, of State Highway 75, which also becomes I-45 further south by downtown Dallas. These forces were now fully engaged with one another on the perimeters as they tried to escape from the strikes that were now coming in, even before the tactical ballistic missiles hit, as the infantry forces had arrived just before the strategic bombing operation. Again, they had pulled into areas that were safe, at least at the time of the carpet munitioning's beginnings, and then they began to advance to where these two companies could cover any conceivable approach from this area, although highly unlikely, as these forces would completely be annihilated by the combo of heavy strategic bombing, the tactical ballistic, and also cruise missile strikes. The two companies in this area, with the company coming in from the northeast, sending only in 2 combat platoons to take up position in this area, leaving another back with their headquarters platoon, which was the command and logistical assets of their company. The one in the southeast, moving in towards the northwest, would move through this apartment complex in this area, and some of their troops would be moving in double column rolling shields behind their armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicle in each platoon, some moving along the rubble in a line formation here, while one of their armor personnel carriers gets up into some of the rubble. They would be able to provide fire cover for the fire support company and their firing platoons and headquarters platoon operating in the area just by Highway 75. As the dual-purpose heavy mortar/assault gun weapons, the PLL-05s, were firing mortar strikes very close by into this area, as they had a complete range of 5.5 miles as a max range as a mortar system. The rockets also firing well short of their total range, as these 130 millimeter rockets from these Type 63 light artillery MLRS systems could fire a max of 5-mile range. They were firing just into this area here, eradicating M113s and Bradleys that were in this particular area. As again, these forces had been bivouacked to defend this entire industrial site, which was mainly the Raytheon facility, but also there were other facilities in the area as well that operated in this particular industrial park. To the northwest, this company, as there was also a platoon of it just off the map, were moving towards the southeast and smashing through the outer fencing of these offices in this industrial park in this area. And some of their squads, as 2 platoons are shown of dismounted squads, were moving into the area to engage these forces on the outer perimeter of the strikes of both the carpet munitioning and missile strikes, as there were some elements that were right on the outer edge and trying to flee the area ahead of the strikes. As there was a housing neighborhood in this area to the immediate north, one company had moved down these 3 streets with their lead ZBDO-4As, and some of their dismounted squads taking up positions behind these homes were laying down fire on these forces on the outer edges here. Were trying desperately to flee ahead of the carpet munitioning that was going on just to their south. As these forces would never make it, as this is encapsulated in red, neither would these, as they were running in the wrong direction, but they were desperate, as this was happening exceedingly rapidly. These forces all being completely stuck, and as they tried to flee, they would all be destroyed by a combination of the carpet munitioning and those on the very edges being hit by a 4,000-pound munition strike, which would come into this area, as this would be close air support against these forces just on the outer edges of the blast. And this 8,000-pound strike with 2 KD-88s fired when this aircraft was many miles away flying into this area, along with strafing attacks by both, would destroy this area of the front offices of the Raytheon facility. And these forces trying to move amid them and behind them would all be destroyed by 12,000 combined pounds of air-to-ground munitions plus KD-88 strikes coming in, and also the fire coming in from these widely spread wedge formations of troops and their vehicle-based fires. Although vehicles would take fire and their troops would take fire, they would lose relatively little, as this was a desperate attempt at a breakout, as this was a double-column rolling shield behind this Bradley trying to get through. Bradley and ZBDO-4As and heavy machine gun-equipped Type 89As were exchanging heavy fire in this area, as this open lot was effectively totally occupied now by one of the 6 mechanized infantry companies moving into the area, as their troops were exchanging fire. As the ZBDO-4A, with its very powerful array of weapons, along with also the potent 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, and also the weapons of the dismounted troops, which were comparatively potent, as the HJO-8 was a very potent ATGM, man-portable, and even the Type 69 with its anti-armor round was capable of destroying an M113 armored personnel carrier. Although the M113 was a somewhat fast-moving armored personnel carrier and could boast a wide array of crew serve weapons such as the 50 cal heavy machine guns, or the Mark 19 belt-fed grenade launching system, or even lighter weapons like the 240 Bravo or the M249 SAW. These vehicles were easy to destroy by even 12.7 millimeter fire, with armor-piercing ammunition especially, and also by the rocket-propelled grenade rounds, such as the anti-armor round, although they could also use anti-personnel fragmentation rounds, which were devastating against dismounted troops. As these troops had been impacted by multiple shots from the 30mm autocannon when this vehicle was further away, coming up on top of the rails, it had blasted them into multiple directions and put a fair amount of shrapnel into this man's torso here. as this man was in a foxhole at the time. He had taken cover behind the sandbags and underground and popped up to fire, but was cut down by the exchange of fire, as the 100 millimeter shell had impacted in the front of this office building and blown out a comparatively large amount of rubble. It had flipped over the tripod mounted 50 cal and threw these men and their limbs in many directions. While others are taking cover in the building and were trying to return fire out of the building, they too were being fired at. This man taken around to the head, and this man likely about to be eliminated as well. The vehicles, again, were easy to destroy by the combination of AI target-seeking mode, heat warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions, which scoured the battlefield and were impacting targets in the area, as well as also the ground-based firepower, especially from the ZBD-04A and its wide array of weapons choices, as the buildings were also being ripped to shreds, along with the personnel and vehicles, this Bradley being hit by a 100 millimeter shell and completely destroyed, with part of the turret blown off to the side here. The fighting on the outer edges of this facility was simply savage, as fighting here in this particular image would have resembled the fighting going on in this area, while the scene in this particular illustration or animation, if you will, was the scene depicted in the empty lot. As also there was fighting in other types of areas, like on the boulevard, on the streets, from another company sending in 2 platoons into that area to cut off these forces from escape. They moved in tactically along the buildings and used the rail line for cover just as much as these forces were trying to do the same, using buildings and the rails for cover. This vehicle taking fire from this platoon over here, and there was another platoon from this company over here, while 2 platoons moved down the boulevard and dismounted their lead platoon, with 2 squads advancing against these 2 squads by this building, and 2 other squads taking position to offer them fire support from this side, L-vectored tactical fire. As that was occurring, the vehicles were out in the boulevard, able to provide fire support to the dismounts as well, with 3 squads from the lead platoon, with the other 2 going this direction, going towards this apartment complex to work together with this other company who had a platoon to the immediate west, as their 2 other platoons were in the center and in the east of this empty lot. As there were 2 squads facing this direction that would bound and cover tactically. This squad had moved ahead, then this squad in a line formation would move, and then they would move one more time to engage these forces, as this squad, 2 half squads, had dismounted from one of their vehicles. One half squad would go this way while the other was here, trying to encounter these forces, although they also would be hit by loitering munition strikes equipped with heat warheads, as the heat warheads would annihilate the vehicles, as those were their primary targets, but would also be able to destroy the troops if crashing into the ground by where the troops stood. It's a swimming pool in this apartment complex. It was a gated apartment complex, but these troops simply overcame the gates and entered in and began to attack this platoon from 2 different directions. As, again, this platoon was part of one of the mechanized infantry companies of the 142nd that was guarding this perimeter, but they had managed to cross the boulevard, get into this area, but then had to pivot and turn to face their attackers and try to fend them off, which they would fail at miserably. These close air support operations by 2 JH-7 strike aircraft were absolutely devastating, as they came in and dropped thousands of additional pounds of munitions, in addition to the carpet munitioning that had occurred by the 2 H-6Ks flying nearly wingtip to wingtip to heavily saturate the area they set out to destroy. And again, they had destroyed a wide swathe of Richardson, a nearly 2-mile long by half-mile wide area, which could have again been larger had they been flying a bit further apart. Again, the fighting in other areas of this battlefield would have also looked like this, where there were troops using rubble as cover from some of the destroyed buildings and engaging enemy personnel trying to flee out in the street, as these personnel are trying to take cover behind their destroyed Bradley, which had been hit in his turret. There are also heavy destruction occurring in the background, which could have been anything such as a mass artillery bombardment from heavy rocket strikes and howitzer repeated strikes, or it could be the heavy carpet munitioning that was occurring from the 2 H-6Ks off in the distance, as The fighting, again, involved a lot of loitering munition strikes as well. These catching vehicles was relatively simple, as vehicles presented themselves as huge targets, but with the amount of dismounts operating in the area, they, too, operating in their squad formations, presented large targets for the loitering munitions also, as much as they were for the troops in the field. As all of the fighting was simply savage in this area, it was essentially a mop-up operation because, again, the two heavy strategic bombers and the missile strikes from the cruise and tactical ballistic missiles had the added effect of not only destroying the site, but also eradicating most of the 2nd of the 142nd in the process, leaving very little left for the mechanized infantry troops to mop up. Hence, sending in one battalion had been more than enough for this particular engagement and operation. As the combat would wrap up in this particular area, seeing very little of these survivors making attempts to flee, they having been heavily bombarded by 130 millimeter rocket strikes, dual purpose 120 millimeter heavy mortar / assault gun strikes used in the mortar capacity, the rockets and mortars being simple to reload and conduct their fire missions, with very few trying to break out and thus being parried and destroyed in the process. These troops moving in to eradicate the last conceivable survivors, including these forces over here, which would get annihilated by the tactical ballistic missile strikes. The breakout was never to occur, as the close air support strikes aiding this company in this particular position in the empty lot were highly destructive and left no survivors. Virtually the entirety of the 2nd of the 142nd, surrounded in this large area, this 3 mile by 1.5 mile area, as it was 1.5 miles north-south, 3 miles east-west, were again completely and totally eradicated. And as a result, the victorious battalion of the 16th Infantry Division would in effect move in and occupy the rubbled, cratered ruins that was the former industrial park that housed not only other industrial sites, but the most important site in the area, which was the Raytheon site. And as it had been completely destroyed and this battalion would remain in the area, they would in effect act as a reserve force to counter any resistance that would arise in this particular portion of the enormous DFW Metroplex, as they would stay in this area to act as a fire brigade, as the saying went, but in effect a fire battalion in literal terms in this area to hold it down, while they would in effect be supporting the flanks of the operations that were still ongoing at this time in the downtown of Dallas, as well as also the capture of the DFW International Airport, which was still going on at the time that this battle ended at 3 a.m., as well as also the clearing of downtown Fort Worth, which would still take a relatively ample amount of time due to the amount of armed reactionary civilians in the downtown area by a single air assault battalion with immense fire support, not only from artillery, but from its own attack helo gunships clearing the streets. They would take hours to clear all the buildings, which this was a major objective to be used as one of the two main red zones along with the downtown of Dallas. And also other battles were raging at this time, including the retreat of the two last surviving companies of the 1st of the 124th Cav, which had wisely, although they were not really fully realizing why they hadn't been destroyed, but it was wisely retreating along I-820, which prevented the PLA from using their heaviest firepower, such as artillery from the 19th or other artillery elements from the other maneuver units against them, because they did not want to destroy the highway system. Missile forces were not used either, and nor was the PLAAF's heavy air power. In fact, they would be pursued instead by the same armored battalion from the 35th Armored Brigade that had destroyed the bulk of the 1st of the 124th and the Naval Air Station in a battle at the very opening of the invasion, as it was a swift battle, as the Naval Air Station and the nearby Lockheed Martin plant were hit by a wide array of weaponry, including artillery, air power, and missile strikes. And as these two companies had fled, they were then being pursued by the same armored battalion, having had attacked with one light mechanized infantry battalion against the Naval Air Station, leaving the light mechanized infantry battalion in the area as they were left to pursue the remaining two companies, as they would also be joined by different forces of the light mechanized infantry moving into the area as well, as the artillery forces were also being utilized heavily throughout the entire Metroplex, not only from the 59th PLA Group Army's Chief Artillery Force, which was the 19th Artillery Brigade, but also the artillery from the 16th Infantry Division, 35th Armor Brigade, and the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, pummeling various targets throughout the city as well, as the Taylor Army heliport had early on been struck heavily by artillery fire from the 16th Infantry Division's PLZ-05, self-propelled 155mm howitzer battalion, as well as also missile strikes from the tactical ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as even combat drone strikes that had harried this facility and completely reduced it to rubble, and the forces that were there upon, which included even the Charlie Company from the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, which was also at the time at the Taylor Army Heliport, which was their home installation, leaving only Bravo and Delta companies to comprise this particular part of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, with its Alpha Company bivouacked with the headquarters of Headquarters Company over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team. In effect, their chief command and administrative force, which was the headquarters of Headquarters Company, which early on, as the artillery began to smash the area, including where they were bivouacked, the surviving forces fled into the southeast of the city of Fort Worth. Just to their south in Burleson, a large battle was going on to seize this particular portion of I-35W, which was part of the main invasion route, along with I-35E, for the external invasion forces to move through the area. In fact, this particular area, in and of itself, would be an important stop along the way for these large group armies, 7 through 13, passing through the area as they would stop to get fuel, maintenance, food, and make sure they were green on ammunition in case they had to expend any on their miles-long convoy, as it would have been a miles-long drive-by for any small force that tried to attack them en route. So this was a major node, and there were larger enemy forces in the area. This required the Trojan units to operate and capture this major node, which was the DFW Metroplex, such as the 59th PLA Group Army and its attached forces, namely the 83rd Air Assault Brigade from the active-duty 83rd Group Army, fighting a separate battle in Houston, although they had their 83rd Air Assault Brigade attached to the forces in the DFW area for the express purposes of this battle. There are also the two paramilitary battalions from the National Construction and Production Corps, the 58th National Construction Battalion and the 405th, which were present early on to defend the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion of the whole 59th PLA Group Army, as they were on CCP regime properties adjacent to the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion. But after the battle, they would develop the red zones into these fortified colonial settlements, as well as also build up the megafobs that would be taken, such as Love Field, the DFW International, and the Meacham International airports, as well as others, as all of the CCP regime properties whereupon these forces began on would simply become combat outposts as satellites of the megafobs that would be built up, as these combat outposts would still contain ample logistics for these forces even after the battle had been won, as many of the logistics would be moved into the new megafobs, there would still remain plenty on the CCP regime properties, which were the original jumping off points for all of these units. As the headquarters of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team was the chief command and administrative elements of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which itself was part of the larger 36th ID, or Infantry Division of the Texas National Guard. These forces of the headquarters were the supreme command elements over the entire defense forces operating in this particular area, all of the subunits of the 56th, and of course the attached units such as the 1st of the 204th, and again the 2nd of the 198th. And as a result, the general in command of all of these forces of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team was a high-value individual that was required to be captured by the PLA. They preferred not to eliminate the commanding elements of American defending forces and instead to capture them, and thus a large operation would occur in the southeast of Dallas conducted by the 59th Special Operations Battalion, the most elite troops of the PLA's Reserve 59th Group Army. This elite and high-tech force would be sent in for the express purposes of surrounding this area to eliminate the remains of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, who were operating in the area trying with the command elements to somehow make it to the Naval Air Station, which by now was completely eradicated at the very opening of the invasion. As they would arrive in the area approximately by 1 a.m., so too would the 59th being guided in through the ISR capabilities and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which would guide them on how best to surround these forces and eradicate them. And they would have an enormous help from the 2 multiple launch rocket battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigade, which would rocket the area specifically to annihilate large groupings of armed reactionary civilians, as well as the elements of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion operating alongside and defending or attempting to defend the command elements over the entire defending forces in the area, which was the headquarters company of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. A very heavy battle would be fought in this area of the city between the Special Operations troops with their heavy artillery support from the 122mm Type 83 multiple launch rocket battalions, which in effect were part of the PHL-81 family of MLRS systems of China. These were an upgrade on them as the Type 83. These 122mm systems dishing out heavy destruction on this part of the city, as both battalions, with some of their comprising firing batteries, would be utilized in this effort to support the Special Operations troops, which also had their own Special Heavy Weapons Company built into their battalion, which had a mortar section to effectively drop 82mm mortars on enemy forces. As all of this would be underway in the early hours of the DFW campaign, the battle would be most heavily fought on the first day, although it would bleed into day number 2 of the 4-day-long invasion, as many armed reactionary civilian elements in the thousands will have fled into the national grasslands on the first day and would thus need to be effectively flushed out, as these could become a potential partisan uprising force, although there were still ample numbers of armed reactionary civilian elements that ended up going underground, having had survived the first day miraculously, and would attempt to come up and conduct ambushes as the original partisan forces that would begin the uprising inside the city. These forces would be mostly brutally crushed, as by then, after day 1, the PLA will have secured the vast majority of the city itself, and would then be sending in an air assault battalion to conduct operations in the national grasslands, which would even be supported on the second day by the A300 or PHL-16 systems, firing their BRE-8 tactical ballistic missiles, their miniature tactical ballistic artillery-based missile systems, into this area alongside of artillery strikes from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade's PCL-181 truck-based systems, which were highly mobile and were very powerful as they were 155mm, as well as also their own attack helo gunships from their battalion, and airstrikes, as the entire air armada operating in this particular battle space could then be redirected in the close air support role against these forces in the national grassland to directly support their air assault forces that would be operating in this particular area. As the air assault battalion, of course, had its own mortar company built into it, these mortars would also support the operation as well as their ground-based fire support, while their attack helo gunships, the very powerful vaunted Z-10s, would support them from the air, along with the PLAAF even higher above them, as the fighting would be heavy and would last for a number of hours in the national grasslands, as the campsites, having had been developed by the fleeing armed civilians, having been established, would all need to be destroyed and overrun to ensure that these forces could be properly flushed out and not constitute a future threat to the occupation forces of the new colonial settlement, which would be the red zones established in the DFW area and all the megafobs, as in this image, Type 69 being fired into the distance against these armed reactionary civilian elements, one being hit in the head, being fired at by other troops in this squad here, while in this image there's an explosion from a mortar, as well as also an ATGM being fired, an HJ-08 from another squad member, just off of this image, this illustration or animation, if you will, a 35mm grenade being fired into the distance, and riflemen and the QBJ-201 being fired. This would be a 2-day-long battle, and the fighting would be heavy, even into the second day. Again, although the heaviest fighting will have resolved by the end of day 1, it would continue into day 2, which would be a massive mopping up effort by the PLA and PLAAF. As the next installation will cover the actions in the southeast of the city of Fort Worth. This will cover the exceedingly important objective of the PLA attempting to capture the leadership of the defending forces, the 56th Infantry Brigade combat teams, headquarters of headquarters elements, including the commanding general. Again, they would have heavy rocket artillery support in this particular operation, and there will be more to come in the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, with the express purpose of conveying fourth-generation warfare doctrines. More to come.